Okay, hello and welcome to chapter 2 of this short series of classes on Le passé dans le présent, the past in the present, for first year master math, master education students. And I left off last time, I'm going to of course continue from where I left off last time, talking about schools. And what official history was taught in schools. Now, this is a little more complex in the United Kingdom because not only is education something which is controlled by the autonomous parliaments for Scotland and for Wales, but also there's a long tradition of regional local education authorities having quite a lot of autonomy. Now, they have less autonomy since the 1980s when a national curriculum was brought in, but the national curriculum, if I understand correctly, does not take up all the hours in the class. And so you'll find quite a lot of difference from region to region and even from school to school in what people teach and how they teach it. Far more variety than you would find in France, if my information is correct. In any case, I looked last time at year 7 and year 8 pupils, what was the most popular history book that they were using, and I looked at just at the front covers, and I'll just finish here with year 9. Here you have year 9, so these people would be 14, I think, they're 14 years old, so not yet taking any national exams. And you can see that here we've moved into at least the 20th century, and we have two people on the front page. Now, the different people on the front page, if I go back to the time before, there seem to be, you know, major figures. And here, of course, we have at the bottom Mohandas Gandhi, who you need to know a few of the main dates of his activity. He began in South Africa, campaigning for rights for colored people, in the technical term they used at the time, and moved on to India and became a leader of the fight for independence, also based on very much on his own religious philosophy, which was mixed up with a way of looking at the world that said that contrary to what the West and the modern era was saying, it was better, village life was better, and that there's a certain sort of back to the village ideology involved. In any case, tremendously powerful political leader who caused the British Empire major headaches and was partly responsible for the winning of Indian independence in 1947, although of course that's a very, very complex history. So the fact that we have him on the front page, though, of a major popular history textbook for schools tells us something. And again, we're here in a situation where history is no longer talking just about great men and great kings and great battles and so on. But not only is it talking about radicals, but even more so, obviously, to put Gandhi on the front page is to suggest that the British Empire was, that the destruction of the British Empire was a good thing, rather than that the British Empire was a good thing. Interestingly enough, the other person on the front page is also a rebel, and I don't think you'll recognize her. This is Sylvia Pankhurst. Now, the Pankhurst family were very much involved in the fight for women's suffrage in Britain, but they were very different. I think it's Emmeline. Yeah, Emmeline is the mother who set things up and went to prison and went into exile in Paris and so on. And two of her daughters were very much involved. That is to say, Christabel and Sylvia. And this one is Sylvia. However, when the First World War broke out in 1914, the entire women's suffrage movement was divided. The vast majority campaigned for the war. The main newspaper changed its name from the Suffragette to Britannia, so you can more or less understand where they're coming from. But a minority, in particular in East London, were against the war and campaigned against the war. And Sylvia Pankhurst was a socialist, campaigning against the war among the suffragettes of East London. She also was involved in working with poor women to try to get ways of making a living. since their men had gone off to war, and in particular they set up I believe, a toy factory in East London. She wrote a very exciting book about it called The Home Front. So just to come back to the question of how the past is presented in the present, you can see that in schools, I'm sure that this is not universal by any means, but in schools there's definitely been a move towards having a much more inclusive curriculum, and perhaps praising rebels where previously there was more praise only for the status quo and for the elites. So Sylvia Pankhurst there and Mohandas Gandhi. So if we go back, though, before, though I showed you there some 20th century, 21st century school textbooks, but if we go back, we have something like this, which I believe is from the 40s. Not absolutely sure, and you can see something much more traditional. With you have your cathedrals, and you have your soldiers, and the English flag and the Scottish flag, and the great voyages of the explorers. You can see, and also the title Britain's Heritage. And what is Britain's Heritage, according to this school history book from many years ago, or long before I was around? Well, this is what it is. This is what you need to be looking at for heritage, something very traditional, royal, colonial, and so on. I have one more example of an old school textbook, which is this one, The March of Time, Book 4, Makers of Our Modern World. And this was published in 1948. Quite a lot of text in it, and far fewer pictures than today. What's interesting, I'm not quite sure what the Makers of Our Modern World, so this is book 4, so you imagine it would be talking about more recent times, but I'm not quite sure the specific significance of the illustrations, but the words used are very much very interesting indeed. First of all, notice the title of the volume, Makers of Our Modern World, the makers, yes, and since there's no doubt, certainly in the attitude of that there are a small number of great people who make the modern world, and we learn about them, and we need to be grateful about them. A little bit in the literal sense, hagiographic. The word hagiography, an extremely important word that you need to look up in the dictionary if you don't know it, is the lives of the saints. And so a hagiographic account is an account that presents the hero as perfect. So you can have a hagiographic account of, Queen Victoria's life, or indeed of Gandhi's life, or whatever. So we are expecting here much more a great people approach the world, and probably mostly great men. And the other thing about this book, which is very, very interesting, is the march of time. So this suggests that, that history marches forward, very traditional. This is what we call a Whiggish view of history, that is to say, automatic progress. And it's understood today that this is absolutely false, and that progress is by no means automatic. And certainly, for example, when women won the right to vote in the 1920s, they could have not won. There was nothing inevitable about that particular victory at that particular time. I remember a first-year student wrote in one of their essays once that women got the vote in 1928 because people realized it was a good idea. This is the absolute stereotype of an insufficient answer, because it doesn't explain why people didn't think it was a good idea 500 years before. So moving away from schools now, but to another public institution which is of great significance when we talk about the past in the present. This is the museum. And again, we're going to see, we saw a development, a change in school textbooks. We're also going to see a change in how museums look at the world. Of course, all museums don't look at the world in the same way. But there is definitely big changes going on, and this is an important part of how the past is presented, generally with public money, although there are private museums, to our community. How this is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, as that famous scholar once said. So museums. Let's look at museums now. Of course, now I'm a historian, so I have to go to 15, 20 museums a year, or I feel slightly ill, but I understand that not everybody is like that. Let's have a look at just a couple of examples, and there's not a, perhaps not a typical example. The great museums that we think of when we say museum, I'm thinking of the Louvre, the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum. So huge and extremely popular institutions. The museums in Britain these days are spread around the country to some extent, but London still concentrates them. You have the Television Museum in Bradford, Maritime Museum in Liverpool, but it is true that London has a great concentration of them. And the British Museum, I'll come back to the British Museum in a moment, because the policies of the British Museum are a tremendous symbol of how the past is repackaged for today's use. But this example I wanted to show you, perhaps a slightly more modern example, the International Slavery Museum. You find it in Liverpool. And so the first question being, why Liverpool? And the second question being, when do you imagine it was opened? Pause for students to answer. So why Liverpool? Of course, I think some of you must have got this correctly, that Liverpool was fundamentally built on the profits from slavery. I think it's very important to remember something about the slave trade. At the time, it was a very respectable among the elite. I think every Lord Mayor in Liverpool for over 100 years had money invested in the slave trade. Because we know how awful slavery was, we have a tendency to look back in history and say, oh, it must be a bit like, the heroin trade today, horrible, vaguely criminal people doing trading in immoral goods. This was not the case at all. It was many shopkeepers in Liverpool would have money in slavery, made a lot of money. That's the main reason for it. So that's the reason it's in Liverpool. The second question was, when was it established? And the answer to that one, oh, there you go. There you get the question again. I wonder if we get the answer. Oh, third question, where is there a slavery museum in France? And the answer is, this one was opened in Liverpool in 2006. And there is a slavery museum in Bordeaux inside the Musée d'Aquitaine, which was opened in 2009. Now, the first thing we can say is that, let's say, official museum, the official heritage industry was not in a hurry to tell the story of slavery. 2006, 2009, well, slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, and I think in the French Empire in 1848. So we can't say they were in a great hurry to have this explained to people. And secondly, it continues to provoke a large number of debates. What is the right way to present slavery in a museum? And we'll look at all of these. It's important to explore these and be able to, certainly, from the point of view of the exam, be able to give an account of a few examples of how the history of slavery presented today is debated. Yes, and again, the most important thing is that for you to be able to present the arguments which are the most common, rather than defend a particular argument, although you may if you wish. So the first thing you notice here is look at the gallery. Life in West Africa, find out about traditional Igbo culture. So you can see here an emphasis which is very significant, and that is that contrary to previous approaches to the history of slavery, where the only attention was given to the terrible conditions of the crossing the Atlantic and then being sold and being badly treated in the United States, or indeed in Brazil and so on, or in the West Indies. This is an attempt to say, well, really, if we're going to study slavery, we also need to know what kind of society were these people kidnapped from. And so this is obviously part of building an approach to the past and the present, which has more respect for the people who didn't win that particular battle. And so that's very interesting there. The other thing you may notice at the top there, International Slavery Museum, how the untold stories of here, the untold stories of enslaved people. And the significant thing here is the expression enslaved people, that this is more, it's preferred today to say enslaved people or enslaved Africans, and not slaves, which which gives more the sound of treating people as objects, as commodities, as indeed they were treated at the time. So there are changes in the way the past is presented, and in this case, the motivation for change is the idea that sufficient space and respect has not been given to the dominated peoples. We will come back to debates and apologies in a later section, but here in the museum, here we have the British Museum. Now, the British Museum, if you've been to London, you've probably seen it. If you haven't been to London, I highly recommend it. I remember being extremely impressed when I saw it for the first time when I was 19. Absolutely bowled over, and it's enormous, enormous museum, the whole sections on different parts of the world. Not all the objects in it are stolen, but some of them are. And one of the most famous pieces is this, which is I think the expression is a moai, which was taken from Easter Island a long time ago. I mean, more than 100 years ago, 150 years ago, probably. I think you can imagine that the permission of the local people was not considered particularly a priority at the time. What's more, this particular moai that they have in the British Museum has inscriptions on the back which identify it as being built at a particular moment of the historical evolution of Easter Island society. It's the pride and joy of the British Museum. However, today, you see the notice here, Easter Island governor pleads with British Museum to give back statue. And this is one of the big debates and controversies which goes on. What should rich countries' museums do with objects which were acquired from dominated countries in ways either often where they don't know about how it was acquired, or when it was clearly just taken without anybody's particular permission. And I'm sure that if you were to go to this article, you find 743 comments of people arguing about it. So this was in the London Evening Standard, of course, and there's a typo there. This is just an example. The Easter Island statue is just one example. There are many more. For the British Museum, for example, the British Museum has a whole section of the Parthenon, so from Athens, what is known as the Elgin Marbles, because Lord Elgin, back in the time, organized its transport to London, and Greece would very much like it to be brought back. In fact, I was in Athens. I was lucky enough to go to Athens about 18 months ago, and in the Parthenon Museum, there's a big picture with marked in red the pieces the British stole, and I'm like, je suis français, je suis français. So this is an ongoing argument between Britain and Greece about the return or not of these marbles. But this is not exceptional. This, over the last probably 10, 20 years, has been coming up. And here you see, just as from The Guardian, a little series of things. France has been urged to change the heritage law and return looted art to Africa, so a campaign to get African objects back to Africa. Lisbon Museum plans stirs debate over Portugal's colonial past. And on the very right, Germany moves slowly on returning museum exhibits to ex-colonies. You can see and there's more, yeah? You can see that in large numbers of ex-colonial powers, this debate, controversy, pressure campaign is a continuing question. And there you go, there's the France Culture even had a program about it. Now, one of the things to notice about museums is they are ever more popular. Now, it is true, I think, that people over 30 are more likely to go to a museum. I think that, once you've left university, you might have had enough of education for a while. Although teachers go a lot to museums, it's true, and you're going to be teachers, or you may already be teachers. And there has been both a move inside museums to make them more accessible and to make them better explained to non-specialists, but also the number of people going to university is ever higher. This is in Britain, the higher education participation rate, and you can see that from 2006 to 2016, in 10 years, they gained 8%. 8% more young people went into higher education. And if you go back to the 1950s, yeah, you can see there the rise from about 20% of people over 16 still in education to well up in the around 80%. Yeah, so there you have the participation. Higher education increased from 3.4% in 1950 to 8.4% in 1970, 19.3% in 1990, and 33% in 2000. So a continuing rise. Now, obviously, people are more educated. Does this make people make people want to go to museums more? I think it does, but I must admit I've not seen studies that actually prove this, so I better look into that. Which takes us on to the next aspect I want to look at, and this is occupying public space. Because public space is sometimes occupied with representations of the past, and there are more of these than you think. Although I know that if you're a historian, every time you see a statue, you go to find out who it is. But I understand that people don't always do that, and sometimes we go past a statue every day and we don't know who it is, or we know the name but we don't know what they did. Let's have a look. Now, of course, some symbols of imperial power have their statue. This is the statue of Nelson at the top of Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. You look like huge column with Nelson at the top. This is an interesting example. As I know, in Paris, there's more a tendency to have symbolic figures like a woman representing the Republic, or the spirit of the Bastille, and so on. But here you have, in the very center in Trafalgar Square, Nelson right at the top, because he did these famous things, mostly involving defeating the French. And so there's choices being made about what parts of the country's past we want to glorify, we want to popularize, we want to see every day, even if we don't always think about it in great detail. Perhaps you saw in the newspapers last week, there was a question of what to do with the statue of Napoleon in Rouen. And would it be a good idea to have a statue of Gisèle Halimi, a radical lawyer who died recently? So these are all this kind of questions that are going on. Here you have another. I think this is also in Trafalgar Square. King George IV in Trafalgar Square. King George IV, as I'm sure you remember, was regent from 1811 till 1820, and then was king from 1820 to 1830. This is the Georgian period. Unsurprisingly, it was King George I, II, III, and IV in that order. So again, in Trafalgar Square, this is the place that millions of tourists go past every month in a normal year, not this year, but the other years, not this year, 2020. And so this is what we're going to have in Trafalgar Square as a part of our glorious past. Are these statues which remind us who we are, as English Heritage was saying about the places that they defend. So there's a large amount of traditional statuary around. Here in the north of England, in Blackburn, just in front of Blackburn Cathedral, you have Queen Victoria. You will also find statues of Queen Victoria around the world, including in Africa and elsewhere. There's Victoria in Blackburn, Lancashire. And this gentleman, I think he's in Leeds. Oh, sorry, in Liverpool. Gladstone, so great prime minister from 19th century England, Gladstone in Liverpool. So this is one important way of occupying public space, with statues of elite figures, elite personages from the stories of the country's past. But it's not the only possible. Oh, just to give you a slight contrast with what is done in Paris. Here you have the one section of the Louvre. Yeah, it's at the Louvre. It's in the north facade, and you can see that this is Napoleon I, represented as the genius of France, invoking Minerva, Mercury, peace and law, so that they succeed to Mars, the god of war, and the military apparel that victory made useless. So this was made in 1811. You can see they have a lot to say, and Napoleon not only presents himself as a wonderful leader, but also as with his mates, who all just happen to be gods or mythological virtues. Yes, so it's a bit like name dropping. You say, you know my friend Minerva. Do you know what my friend Minerva said to me the other day? So yeah, France is no exception. I ought to just say a little word from the point of view of the exam. Although you may occasionally use a French example, it has to be occasional, because you're supposed to be showing that you've been learning Anglophone, the history of Anglophone countries. One last thing on statues, and I'll be stopping for today. Here you have a statue, which in fact is in Ireland, and perhaps you recognize the gentleman as Oscar Wilde, perhaps not. And certainly you can see it's a modern statue and much more recent than the previous ones you saw. First of all, because it's in color, whereas the tradition is not to have statues in color in public spaces. And secondly, because the gentleman is in a very relaxed position and not on a pedestal, but lying on a rock, like you do. So what's interesting about this is that these are some of the new ways which the past is presented. First of all, Oscar Wilde is a writer, so not a king or a prime minister. There is more of a tradition. There is a tradition to having statues of writers, but there's one something particular. But the other question that you might ask yourself is that, well, Oscar Wilde died a long time ago. I don't have his exact date of death in mind. Why is this statue so modern? And perhaps you can guess the answer. The answer is that for a very long time, because Oscar Wilde had been, who was a homosexual, and had been in prison for that, people did not want, certainly elites did not want statues of Oscar Wilde around. So there is Oscar Wilde in Dublin, showing some of the new things which are being done with statues. I have another example here. So, oh yes, so it was erected in 1997, the statue of Oscar Wilde. So you see, it had to. There was a long time before this the well-known homosexual could have his statue in public. And here we have another example. Again, you can see that it is a modern statue because he's sitting down, which is not a tradition. And this is Alan Turing, the very, very recent statue of 2013. Alan Turing was a great mathematician, also a homosexual, and indeed I think it's in the 1950s that he was arrested, and they gave him the choice of going to prison or being given a very heavy hormone therapy which was supposed to cure him, and in fact the result was that he committed suicide. And so that's a horrible story, not that unusual, but he was famous. And this is so statues occupying public space as a way of repairing, putting right some injustices from the past in a world where attitudes, in this case to homosexual people, have changed tremendously. That's just over half an hour, so I'm going to stop there. This was chapter 2. There will be more. I stop that, and then I stop this. And then I stop this. And then I stop